Welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving headfirst into a total whirlwind of recent political claims, local scandals, and high-stakes international military standoffs, all drawn directly from our source material. We've got a fascinating amount of ground to cover, and we're going to cut right through the noise to look exactly at what the sources are reporting. So let's get right into it. Here is our roadmap for the day. We'll be hitting redistricting and the courts, looking into some Louisiana leadership scandals, debating gerrymandering and hypocrisy, Trump's space comments, anti-aging and cellular health, and finally, escalating U.S.-Iran tensions. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, redistricting and the courts, and the fight for the South. So, following a recent Supreme Court ruling centered on Louisiana redistricting, the source material asserts that this single decision is a massive deal. The commentary suggests this could actually put up to 19 congressional seats in play across the South by the 2026 or 2028 election cycles. 19! When you think about how incredibly narrow congressional majorities have been lately, 19 seats is just a staggering number. It literally reshapes the whole electoral battlefield for the next few years. And what's really fascinating here is how this source underscores the intense political friction this caused. They point straight to House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who heavily criticized the Supreme Court after this ruling. Our source interprets Jeffries' quote, where he says everything to deal with this corrupt mega-majority is on the table, as a pretty clear signal. They argue the Democratic Party is basically laying the groundwork to potentially pack the Supreme Court if they regain power. On the flip side, the source presents the Republican counter-strategy, highlighting Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. It focuses on his aggressively defiant response to these mapping battles, quoting his readiness for maximum warfare to defend GOP redistricting efforts. By saying, "Go ahead, make my day," he's effectively daring opponents to challenge their maps in states like Florida. It makes it crystal clear that local Republican leadership has zero intention of backing down from these high-stakes territorial fights. Moving right along to Section 2, Louisiana leadership scandals and local corruption allegations. Shifting gears from those national mapping battles, the source takes a pretty wild detour into what it explicitly dubs a scandal factory operating within Louisiana's local politics. Looking at the details, they pull together three highly specific, incredibly severe local controversies. First up, we've got a New Orleans sheriff facing a 30-count indictment that allegedly includes helping jailbreak 10 inmates. Then, there's a Winsboro mayor charged with a $75,000 Medicaid fraud scheme. And finally, a former mayor of DeRidder convicted of statutory rape involving her son's friend, a deeply disturbing abuse of power. It's a heavy list, and the narrator explicitly links these three shocking local cases to argue that there's a deep systemic leadership issue currently plaguing the state's local officials. Next up is Section 3, debating gerrymandering and hypocrisy, focusing on the Obama argument. Staying with the theme of redistricting, but shifting our focus over to political rhetoric, the source breaks down a very specific claim of hypocrisy leveled against former President Barack Obama, and this perfectly illustrates the commentator's core argument. They place two of Obama's recent political stances right side by side to argue that they fundamentally conflict. On one hand, the source notes Obama supported a Virginia redistricting measure intended to flip seats blue, a measure a judge later struck down as misleading and unconstitutional. On the other hand, they contrast this with his anger over the Supreme Court's Louisiana ruling, where he claimed stopping maps based on race guts minority voting power. So the source uses this exact comparison to suggest that stances on gerrymandering conveniently shift depending on which party actually benefits. All right, Section 4, Trump's space comments, centering on an Oval Office interaction. Moving completely away from maps and into presidential press interactions, our source material highlights a recent moment in the Oval Office between Donald Trump and the Artemis II moon astronauts. The source frames this specific quote, "I would have had no trouble making it," as a lighthearted off-the-cuff remark. Basically, after congratulating the astronauts, Trump joked about being an astronaut himself, citing his great health and physical ability. The commentary really emphasizes that this was just a casual interaction with the press, but then immediately points out the fierce, disproportionate political reaction it triggered from his opponents. According to the commentary, political critics eagerly seized on this astronaut quote. Opponents use this seemingly innocuous joke to argue that the sitting president has actually lost his mental capacity and ought to be removed from office. The narrator's perspective here is that this was a classic case of political theater, turning a minor molehill into a massive mountain just to question a rival's mental fitness. Now for Section 5, anti-aging and cellular health. We're looking at a commercial pivot here. And a totally abrupt pivot from political theater, the source transitions directly into a sponsor segment, and they hook the audience with a pretty stark question. They point out that U.S. life expectancy actually peaked at age 78 back in 2014. They blame things like environmental toxins, chemicals in our food, and other external factors for a broader global decline in longevity. It's a fascinating framing strategy, designed to make you acutely aware of biological aging right before they pitch a solution. And that brings us to the sponsor's pitch for a supplement called Kimchi 1. It allegedly delivers a massive dose of over 900 probiotic strains for digestion, antioxidants to protect cells and slow down aging, plus natural antimicrobials to fight off external threats like bacteria and viruses. The whole pitch is that you get all these complex cellular benefits conveniently packed into a single USA-made capsule. Finally, Section 6, escalating U.S.-Iran tensions, specifically around the Strait of Hormuz. Jumping from cellular health back into the high-stakes theater of global geopolitics, let's trace this timeline to see exactly how this tension builds. The source reports that Mojtaba Khamenei issued a fiery, ghost-written threat to clear the Persian Gulf of American presence. A few days later, Iran's Navy chief threatened to literally sink U.S. battleships. But rather than immediately dropping bombs, the U.S. responded by extending a bombing pause. Instead, they maintained a strict, suffocating naval blockade, which leads right into heavy financial sanctions. The source reports that Trump views this economic blockade as highly effective. He colorfully described Iran's economy as choking like a stuffed pig due to strangled oil exports and totally dry cash reserves. The commentary notes that the administration is flat-out refusing to ease these sanctions or negotiate until Iran accepts a zero nuclear weapons policy. For them, that's the only way forward. So the absolutely crucial point here is that this economic squeeze isn't just about ships in a strait. It's being tightened by a massive financial sledgehammer. The U.S. Treasury sanctioned 35 specific entities tied directly to Iran's shadow banking network. According to the source, the goal is to target the oil money meant to fund the Revolutionary Guard and their proxy terror groups. They're hitting their wallet rather than just their bunkers. However, even with all this focus on financial pressure, the source notes the U.S. remains fully prepared for a kinetic war. Reports indicate that 3 potential military operations are actually on the table for upcoming briefings. We're talking short, powerful strikes on infrastructure, a full ground operation to seize the Strait of Hormuz, or even a high-risk special forces raid to physically secure Iran's uranium stockpile. We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We've looked closely at how the source material frames everything from fierce partisan redistricting battles and local corruption to staggering economic blockades abroad. By analyzing this material, we can see exactly how these narratives are constructed. And the overarching question we have to leave you with is this. As these intense pressures continue to mount both at home and overseas, how will they ultimately resolve, and how will they fundamentally reshape our political landscape? Thanks for learning with us today, and keep asking the big questions.